So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We're lucky enough to have a second representative of the WTO with us today. This is Clemens Boonekamp, Director of the World Trade Organization of Agriculture and Commodities Division. From the Netherlands, Dr. Boonekamp completed a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctoral degree in economics from Rhodes University, Simon Fraser University, and Brown University, respectively. Prior to joining the WTO, Dr. Boonekamp was a member of the economics faculty of the University of British Columbia and was a senior economist with the International Monetary Fund. Dr. Boonekamp joined the WTO in 1991 and since then has served with the Trade Policies Review Division and the External Relations Division. Dr. Boonekamp was director of the Trade Policies Review Division from 1998 to 2009 when he was appointed to his current position. Additionally, he has been published in economics journals in Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Today, he will be talking about food security and trade. Thank you very much.
That makes me sound a lot better than I really am. And one point of correction on that bio is that I was at the WTO. I am no longer there. I recently left it. And the last position I did hold while I was there was indeed Director of Agriculture at the WTO. I know you're in the midst of a long day actually, and I'm the first speaker of two more to come after me. So I'll try not to bore you for, well, at least for too long. What I want to talk about is food security, in particular food security and trade. The problem can be stated very quickly and rather dramatically, actually. There are 7 billion. We've just passed a world population of 7 billion. Of those 7 billion, some 1 billion go hungry every day. That's the problem of food security. It's as stark, as real as that. And the implications of it are also very real. Hunger undermines a people. It undermines intelligence. It therefore undermines growth potential of economies. It undermines development. More than that, it's a moral imperative for all of us to ensure that people don't go hungry. It's a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative, it's a political imperative. The problem is made worse by the fact that when we look at the amount of food there is available in the world. Over the past it took 50 years or so for world population to double to 7 billion. During that period, food output trebled. And in particular, food output of cereals, the basic foodstuffs, the staple foodstuffs, more than trebled. That means there's enough food in the world. There really is enough food in the world. We just don't seem to be able to get it to the right people. We don't seem to be able to make sure that those who are hungry are able to get the food that they need. Now, this is a problem that deeply concerns not just politicians, it concerns the G20. The G20 has put it at the top of its agenda. It concerns the international community. Ban Ki-moon established a high-level task force on the matter. And it's very much at the heart of what the WTO does in the area of trade. But before I go there, and I want to spend a few minutes on that, before I go there, let's remember governments are absolutely sovereign. Governments are able to apply the policies that they need, that they think they need, to achieve food security. And food security, when we think about it, is a government problem, is a problem that is particular to, it is a national responsibility to ensure that a nation's people are appropriately fed. It's a national responsibility, but it has become also an international responsibility, and I'll get to that. But governments are free to choose the policies that they think are appropriate to achieve food security for their populations. They are sovereign to do so. And one of the choices, and this is something that I think we all need to think about, one of the choices that governments can make and indeed that one or two have tried to make, is self-sufficiency. And it is an argument that is very much in the forefront. For example, it is made by Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Governments should promote self-sufficiency so that nations are able to feed themselves. At least the food is then in the country where it is supposed to be. Does it make any sense to do that? Politically, sometimes maybe. Economically, probably not. If governments seek to produce all their own food requirements, they are, and now I'm an economist talking, going to detract resources away from more efficient uses. That is, they will in actual fact probably be undermining the gross domestic product of their countries. It'll be less than it would otherwise be. And that means that purchasing power, the domestic purchasing power, will actually be less than it would otherwise be. And yet purchasing power is one of the keys to food security. There are lots of people who suffer hunger in front of a packed food stand. They just don't have the money to buy the food. That purchasing power is a key to actually achieving food security. That means it is a duty in this context of governments to actually assure that they have the necessary purchasing power for their people to be able to buy the food. The rest is, again, using an economic terminology, the rest is maximization of a social welfare function, and that includes distribution. It is government policy should then be directed as their people wish to ensuring that there is an appropriate distribution such that the population is able to buy food. But their first objective should be to ensure that they maximize the use of their resources so that purchasing power at a domestic level is actually maximized. I can put this into rather stark terms. You've all heard of the Irish potato famine. The Irish potato famine, when thousands starved and helped populate the United States of America because they left. They couldn't get any food. Well, concurrently with the Irish potato famine, there was a Dutch famine. The Dutch, too, have potatoes as part of their staple, and the Dutch ran out of potatoes. The potato crop failed in Holland as well. But there wasn't a Dutch food famine. There wasn't a Dutch food famine because the Dutch had diversified the use of resources, and they had the income to buy food elsewhere. So there was no hunger in Holland at that particular time. What I'm suggesting to you is that in this idea of food security, one of the clues, one of the tricks to it, one of the elements that is vital to food security is actually trade. That trade be allowed to go from where the food is to where it is necessary. And if that is the case, then trade needs to be as free of impediments as we can possibly make it. Now, that sounds logical. It sounds logical to me. It sounds logical to a lot of people, including the G20, including the high-level task force on food security. What is perhaps not as obvious, though, is that trade is by no means a magic bullet. And trade on its own is certainly not the answer. In fact, if you rely simply on trade, if you simply decide to liberalize your trading system, you might, given the impediments that are imposed elsewhere, given the structural constraints that you might have in your own economy, actually be worse off. You're not going to often hear somebody from the WTO say something of that sort, but trade is not a magic bullet that makes you better off. Trade is part of a comprehensive, coherent economic strategy that allows you, if applied appropriately, implemented appropriately, allows you to better allocate your resources, therefore increase the purchasing power that you might have available. But that on its own, that has to be complemented, in the case of agriculture, with decent extension services, with a good investment program, with decent macroeconomic policies. Trade on its own is not going to do it, but trade certainly in cooperation, in coherent policies with other strategies will help you make things better. Now, at that particular point, the WTO becomes, and Rufus spoke to you about this a little this morning, the WTO becomes an important element. The WTO has within its tool bag, as it were, something called the Agreement on Agriculture. And the Agreement on Agriculture came out of a long series of negotiations in the 80s and early 90s called the Uruguay Round. Prior to that Agreement on Agriculture, trade in agriculture was severely constrained. Trade in agriculture was almost suffused with distortions. There were barriers to it at virtually every border. Countries were intent upon protecting their own particular agricultural structures, to the detriment of very often developing countries. I remember being in Tanzania once. Walked into a supermarket in Tanzania, found a liter of milk, one of these Tetra Pak liters of milk, exactly the same Tetra Pak liter of milk that I could buy in a local store in France. Yet in Tanzania, that Tetra Pak liter of milk, which had been imported from France, cost 1/3 the price of the Tetra Pak in Tanzania. Now think of what that does. Think of that French milk going all the way from Paris to Dar es Salaam, or not from Paris, but somewhere in France, all the way from there to Dar es Salaam, selling at 1/3 the price that it was sold in Paris. What do you think that did to the Tanzanian dairy farmer? It helps wipe out the Tanzanian dairy industry. That was one of the problems that was existent prior to the Uruguay Round, prior to the Agreement on Agriculture. What that meant, and that was as the result of export subsidies. Similarly, the European Union at that particular time was subsidizing its own wheat production to the extent of about 150, and I'm going to use dollars, about $150 a ton. The world price of wheat was only about $100 a ton. How much wheat do you think was being grown in the European Union? The European Union was overgrowing wheat with the result that countries that are efficient at producing wheat, such as Argentina, Australia, and a number of countries in Africa, South Africa, were not able to actually export their own wheat. They weren't able to use agriculture to improve their own economic situation. This was realized. What needed to be done was that the agricultural playing field had to be, to some extent, leveled. The Uruguay Round did that. It began to level the agricultural playing field. It set up a more equitable trading structure and more equitable production structure for agriculture. That has helped. The amount of distortions in the market have actually gone down. The stage has been set for a better playing field, but the problem is far from having been solved. There are still these billion people that go hungry. Their food is still not traveling the way it should travel. Compounding that particular fact that the playing field is not actually level is the fact that there is an awful lot of food that is actually wasted. In developed countries, because of standards, sell-by dates, for example, it is estimated that perhaps as much as 25% of food is actually wasted. In developing countries, it's probably even worse. It's not because of very high sanitary and phytosanitary standards, but because of a lack of infrastructure, because of a lack of storage facilities, because of the fact that you simply cannot keep stuff long enough for it to be edible by the time it gets from the field to the table. In other words, there is also an enormous difficulty here in still generating sufficient investment so as to be able to make sure that the food that is produced is able to get to where it is, to where it is necessary. What that means is that we need to continue to improve the investment environment. the investment environment so that there will be an incentive in countries which have a food shortage to produce more food, in countries that have a surplus of food to be able to export it profitably, but also at reasonable prices to places where that food is actually needed. That means that the WTO continues to have a tremendous amount of work to do in leveling the playing field for agriculture. Now, how far have they gotten? They've actually gotten quite a long way. There is, in something called the Doha Development Agenda, and you may all have heard of the Doha Development Agenda, a tentative modalities for an agreement on agriculture. Those modalities are virtually done, but there are still some stumbling blocks in those modalities that prevent an agreement from actually being achieved. Part of the stumbling block is actually in other areas of the negotiations, and Rufus may have spoken to you about that. It's particularly in non-agricultural goods. But in agriculture itself, there are still some difficulties, and one of the difficulties that is there is a difficulty that is beginning to make people wonder whether the agreement might actually be achievable at all. And that is that over the last number of years, some of the emerging economies have suddenly begun to produce far larger quantities of food. I think of China in particular. Now, that sounds like a good thing, except that if you're at the negotiating table and you have, as for example the United States or the European Union have agreed that they will significantly cut their domestic supports for agriculture, and at the same time it has become clear to you that as a result of significantly increased production in another country, China in this case, China is going to be able to significantly increase its domestic supports, you're beginning to wonder at that point whether the agreements that you are about to achieve actually do level the playing field or do move towards a further leveling of the playing field, or whether the agreement you're about to reach might actually tilt the playing field against you yourself. And that's one of the difficulties that is now bedeviling the system. That is that there has been a significant change in environment such that what is presently on the table is no longer obviously to some going to level the playing field. Another difficulty that is there, and it's something that you may have heard of as well, is that all of the agreements that had been negotiated in the past were actually negotiated in a period of falling prices, or at least low prices, for agricultural foodstuffs. As a result of that, the trick was to try and prevent access to markets at relatively low food prices, and to prevent domestic supports for agriculture that might actually lower the prices even farther. That is, you were dealing essentially with the import side of agriculture. Now the situation is that food prices are actually on the rise in part because of changing diets in places like China, but also Africa. And with those rising food prices, there are countries such as the Ukraine, such as Russia, such as Vietnam, who begin to think that the prices are going too high in their own countries. They therefore seek to protect their own populations from higher prices, and therefore put trade restrictions on exports of their foodstuffs. And those trade restrictions on exports of their foodstuffs actually cause prices to go even higher. The environment, that is, has suddenly changed, and it has suddenly changed quite dramatically. The trick now is, given that we know that trade is an essential element of all of this, given that we know that the agreements that are presently on the table on trade are probably not yet good enough to ensure that food moves appropriately from where it is to where it should be, can we actually get to the point of improving the agreements? The WTO, we were very close. The problem is becoming harder, and it's becoming harder in part because some people are actually beginning to produce more. It's becoming harder in part because prices are rising, and with prices rising, those who have the food don't really want to let it go elsewhere. Therefore, is there now sufficient will amongst negotiators to cut through the difficulties that they now face so that the trading system can become cleaner, can become a more level playing field, and eventually so that the investment environment can improve, leading finally to the fact that these 1 billion people that now go hungry do not go hungry in the future. I'm going to stop at that particular point and perhaps leave it up and ask you for questions.
Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
My name is Akin Akiboye. I'm from the University of Wageningen.
From where?
From the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands.
Wageningen?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm teasing you at the moment.
Yes, yes. I'm an academic researcher from the Department of Disaster Studies and Humanitarian and Post-Conflict Reconstruction. Now, we all know that we cannot speak of peace where there is mass hunger. And when people are hungry, they don't fear to die by challenging their government that is corrupt. Now, what is the impact of the multinationals in terms of food security? Because they have the power in terms of monetary and in terms of economic influence and so on and so forth, and they can even use food to actually succumb. You know, some people are agitating for certain things for change, for their own personal gains. What is your view about that?
I'm not. You seem to be suggesting that food is used as a weapon.
Yes.
Okay. I think food might well be used as a weapon in certain internal conflicts. I'm not sure that countries between themselves use food as a weapon. That said, I think it is also a duty. Countries have duties to help each other in case of need, and that is one of the elements of food security. If there is a food crisis, then there is, to my mind at least, a moral imperative that countries come to the assistance of others. That is institutionalized in the role of the World Food Programme. The World Food Programme does a very significant job in making sure that places such as the Horn of Africa are actually fed when the Horn of Africa is in need of food. It isn't always, and this is part of the problem. It isn't always able to do it successfully. It isn't always able to do it successfully because although the World Food Programme may actually have the food available, do you know how long it takes for food that is landed in Mombasa to get to, for example, Burundi? It has to cross borders. It has to go through over very bad infrastructure. It doesn't get there. Food might land in Djibouti, but to get into Darfur takes convoys, and at the present moment it takes armed convoys to get it there. Half of that food is wasted by the time it gets there. So although the international community might, in the context of food aid, actually be doing its job appropriately in getting the food towards the location, often the national infrastructure is not sufficient to allow it. What that means is that the international cooperation has to go way beyond just food aid. It has to go also in the direction of helping countries to better governance, and I think that's part of what you're talking about. It has to help them get to a point where the infrastructure is appropriate. It has to help them get to a point where trade is actually facilitated across frontiers. Trade is facilitated through national territories. Now, I'm not sure I want to go beyond what I've just said, but
yes,
what all of this points to is that it isn't trade alone that is the answer here, or it isn't trade alone that is even a major part of the answer. A major part of the answer is national governance. A major part of the answer is infrastructure. A major part of the answer is international aid for trade, Rufus may have spoken to you about Aid for Trade, making sure that the infrastructure is appropriate so that when the food begins to move, it can actually get there.
Oh, sorry, I have to come back to you.
Now,
The reason being that, the multinationals seems to work, closely with the nationals, to especially the national farmers, to actually, use their own power to actually increase the prices of food in their own country to the detriment of those farmers, because those farmers, national farmers, will not have what it takes to actually challenge them or compete with them. Therefore, they will actually rely on importation rather than actually using the national resources to establish, a sort of efficient and effective, food security within the country.
well, that gets back to the point of self-sufficiency that I spoke about right at the beginning. Simply because you raise, for example, you raise tariffs in order to encourage your domestic farmers to grow food, does not mean that there will actually be more food available. In fact, if you track this through, if you track the economic logic of this through, you might actually, what you're going to be doing is producing expensive food at home, which is not to the advantage of the urban poor. You will be producing expensive food at home when you could be using those resources to produce something else more efficiently that might be able to allow you to purchase more food abroad. It is an ironic fact that if you try and use the trade structure, if you try and use domestic tariff policies to increase food production, you could actually end up with less food. I mean, that's and at Wageningen they would have spoken to you about that. Wageningen is a university in the UK, in the Netherlands, which is specialized in some sense in agriculture, and has a very strong program on sanitary and phytosanitary regulations, where the WTO contributes every year. That's how I know about it. But they will have told you about that. They will have told you about the fact that the trick is to use your resources properly.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions?
You're laughing at me.
Yes, Roberto Bonino from Geneva. What is the impact of agriculture for biofuels in the global food security issue?
That's part of the changed environment. Agriculture for biofuels is, and particularly for basic cereals, maize, it drives up the price. And in driving up the price, it's diverting resources away from feeding people to feeding cars. Now, you're gonna, the trick here is, and it was identified by the G20 in a plan of action that G20 ministers put together last year, is to try and make sure that those biofuels that are being produced, and the market may actually require those biofuels to be produced that way, is that they are not being produced with subsidized resources. So that if the market does actually, there's nothing wrong with prices going up, by the way. If you happen to be a farmer and prices are going up, you like this. But the trick is to make sure that those resources that are going into the production of biofuels do not have a more efficient use elsewhere. In many cases, the biofuels are being produced, such as in the United States, with targeted programs that subsidize the production of those biofuels. And that's true also to some extent with sugarcane in Brazil. And then it does begin to get at the very fact that I'm talking about, that you're detracting from purchasing power, domestic purchasing power, to buy food. But it is part of the changed landscape, the changed environment.
I was just wanting to add to what you said, that this seems to be more of a political problem and not a trade problem. But since you are such an expert, would you have any ideas on how do we solve this?
No, when I
perhaps
I misspoke. I mean, no, I said that food security is also a political problem, and it's put that into somewhat more of a context. Food is emotional. We have to be fed to live. Governments, therefore, are going to want to maintain a certain viability in the production of food. That means that governments will want to maintain a certain support for their agriculture. You in Finland know that better than most, okay? It's not that Finland cannot buy all the food that it might possibly want, but Finland does have memories of what happened when it was in strife and it had to find the food in its own borders. That goes on. And then the changing landscape is such that people want to hang on to an agricultural landscape to some extent. This is particularly true in France. They want to hang on to that. Agriculture in that sense becomes multifunctional. It becomes part of the political landscape to hang on to an agricultural ability. And that's what I mean also by political. You have to, in other words, arrive at an international agreement that allows governments to feel that they have within that international agreement, to which they are bound if it's part of the WTO, the wherewithal to satisfy the political demands that they have in their own economies to support their agriculture. And you know that in Finland, that's a real problem in Finland, you know that. I mean, there is real, Finland, Norway, you both have this problem that, I'm not going to call it a problem, but you both have the reality that there is an agricultural lobby. And that agricultural lobby is politically powerful. And that agricultural lobby is politically powerful because it speaks to something very emotional, namely the ability of people to feed themselves.
Okay, do we have any last questions?
To prolong what you were just saying, the border between economic aspects and political aspects are becoming blurred more and more, especially by the lobbyings. Yeah. In Brussels, lobbying is terribly powerful and uses many people working for many different interests, either private or public. And I would like to know, in terms of cultural diplomacy and sustainable development, how you see the role or the limitation to the role of lobbyists. Thank you.
Yeah. The Common Agricultural Policy was part of founding the European Union. It was a necessary political tool to actually to get the French to trade with the Germans. But the Common Agricultural Policy turned out to be enormously expensive. And the Common Agricultural Policy came under severe attack because of the distortion that it created in international markets, came under very severe attack. And as a result, the Common both as a result of the expense and as a result of the attack, the Common Agricultural Policy has undergone fairly significant reform. That significant reform has moved towards reducing the trade distortions that are inherent in the Common Agricultural Policy. But it is still the case, and particularly in places like France, Finland, that the need to support agriculture remains very strong, and that's where the lobbies come in. The lobbies under these circumstances need to be persuaded, and I think they are being persuaded, that there are ways of supporting agriculture that do not interfere with the rights of third countries such as Argentina, Burundi. And I think that is what is actually happening. There is an education process that has taken place. It's an education process that has taken place in large measure because of work that is undertaken in places like the WTO to convince them that, yes, supporting agriculture for whatever reasons, multifunctional reasons that you might have, is one thing. Supporting agriculture to the point where it actually begins to hurt opportunities that others might have is not appropriate. And I think these lobbies have come to understand that. And I think these lobbies have come to see that one of the ways of supporting agriculture without hurting third parties, or at least by minimizing the damage to third parties, is to give them what are direct payments, for example, and to help them in support a livelihood that does not produce excess production to the detriment of, for example, Tanzania with the milk example I gave you. Does that begin to answer your question? I'm not sure it does, because it's a devilish question.
No, it's enlightening a very important aspect of the agricultural policy. But my question was more on lobbying in general, in where there is trade and where there are governmental decisions made in which have their impact on the multinational organizations or multinational companies. Thank you. But that I fully agree with what you said.
Yeah, but you also raise an interesting point. I mean, you know, I know that an organization such as the WTO is not subject to lobbying per se in the way that commissioners or the way that members of the European Parliament are actually subject to lobbying. But I do know that the European Commission may bring to the WTO positions that they have been persuaded to take as a result of lobbyists. Then think about it, the next step. If that is the case, the Commission may indeed feel that it is necessary to take a position to the WTO as a result of lobbyists. But the Commission may quietly be hoping that the WTO turns it down. And then but that's an important point, because then the WTO, or an organization such as the WTO, becomes part of the protection against lobbying, against legislators being persuaded to make bad law as a result of lobbyists. So the WTO is part of a governance structure that allows you to keep the road the road more level. There is, you know, WTO doesn't really care as an institution to being the bad guy, and if it's the bad guy in helping you keep your house in order, that's probably a good thing.
Okay, I think.
If you allow me, just the last aspect. If we pursue in this question of lobbying, all farmers have not the same power to lobby through organizations. And in a country like France, which is mine, clearly some organization representing the most powerful and the richest farmers have for decades represented the French agriculture in the Brussels through the government or not, or directly lobbying Brussels. They have been much more powerful, probably not always in a very wise way, to Brussels than others representing small farmers. And finally, the system has advantaged the richest, the greatest of farmers, including the Prince of Monaco. Thank you.
Yeah, but there's one of the difficulties with, and it's an identified difficulty with the common agricultural policy. If you have a system of intervention prices, and if you take wheat as an example, the farmers around Reims are quite capable of producing wheat at world prices. But these wheat farmers for a long time around Reims were being given huge supports to produce wheat, with the result that they were making large profits, but the small wheat fields in the Savoie, you know, were simply eking out a living, and were in actual fact being paid just the marginal amount to remain in production, and were poor.
I think if we could just conclude there. I understand it's a point of contention. If you could.
It's not a point of contention. I think he agrees with me.
So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Clemens Boonekamp for joining us today, and I'd like to see if you could all join me in thanking him.